بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. وبعد, to continue inshallah with al-Muhadhab min Ihya Ulumuddin by Hujjatul Islam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala wa radi'an, and we reached al-Bab al-Khamis, Salatul Jummah. So we covered the actions of the prayer specifically, and now we move on to Jummah, so the issues relating to al-Jum'ah from a spiritual perspective. So he says, Fadilatul Jum'ah, he's going to speak about the virtue of al-Jum'ah. He says, اعلم أن هذا يوم عظيم عظم الله به الإسلام وخص به المسلمين. قال الله تعالى إذ نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specified this day and made it a great day, a day which unfortunately it seems that we don't give its due, and perhaps all of us, we fall into this, and this is a point that we'll come back to later inshallah. He says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has specified the Muslims with this day, i.e. this is a day specifically to the people of Islam, and he's going to speak a bit more about it later, but we are the only people from the people of the revelation that have come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, i.e. the Quran, the Torah, the Injil, etc., that celebrate the day of Jum'ah. We are the only ones that worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically in a specific way on Jum'ah. And there are ahadith about this, and there are commentaries that the ulama have given for the ahadith which relate to this issue. Why is it that the Jewish communities and the Jewish people worship on Saturday and the Christians on Sunday, etc.? But that's not the point of this evening's discussion or class. And then he mentions the ayah, when you are called towards the prayer on Yawm al-Jum'ah, فَاسْعَوْا إِلَى ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, then start to make your way towards the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what salah is. Salah is remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are various types of dhikr. There is dhikr with the tongue, dhikr with the heart, as we mentioned, and there is also dhikr of action. Dhikr of action. Your salah is dhikr of action, where you are remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with your limbs, remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with your entire body. And likewise, even establishing the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's dhikr. It's dhikr, and it's the greatest form of dhikr. Why? Because you are establishing the framework that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed for us, and you are sacrificing that which is necessary to sacrifice in order to establish it. And that's the ultimate form of remembrance. And that's a form of remembrance that we need to consider and engage in. Sacrificing that which we have of time, of intelligence, of wealth, of physical strength, for the sake of establishing the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Sharia is the greatest form of remembrance. Then he says, فَحَرَّمَ الْإِشْتِغَالَ بِأُمُورِ الدُّنْيَا وَبِكُلِّ صَارِفٍ عَنِ السَّعِي إِلَى الْجُمْعَةِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, due to the significance of al-Jum'ah and the Salatul Jum'ah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it haram to busy ourselves with anything other than the Salah and preparation for the Salah, i.e. trading and bartering and engaging in business and so on and so forth. Going back to the point that was mentioned earlier, unfortunately, and if you stand on the mimbar, you have a better view of this perhaps than when you're sitting in the masjid. But unfortunately, we don't give Jum'ah its significance in the way that we prepare ourselves for Jum'ah. So we should be dressing, for example, Eid. On Eid, whether it's Eid of Eid al-Fitr or Eid al-Adha in Ramadan, or after Ramadan, after Hajj, we prepare ourselves for that day. You'll find brothers are cutting their hair, presenting themselves in a nice way, sisters wearing the best of their clothes, brothers wearing the best of their clothes, etc. But Jum'ah, you find that we come to the masjid and we're wearing a t-shirt and tracksuit bottoms, or we're wearing anything that we pull out of our wardrobes. And that's incorrect. We're supposed to adorn ourselves for the day of Jum'ah. Taking a shower or a bath, ghusl, on Jum'ah. Why? A part of it is ritualistic worship. A part of it is because of the large congregation so that you don't harm others with any foul smells, etc. But a part of it is also ritualistic. It's worship. It's to give the day its due right, the significance of the day of Jummah. And for the Muslims, it's a holiday. It's not a day that we should be working, really. It's a day of ibadah, a day of worship, a day of dhikr, a day of ukhuwah, brotherhood, etc. And so we should endeavor to give Jummah its due right. We should try to wear the best of our clothes on Jummah. Try to, at least wear, a particular type of thobe that's not like a casual thobe, for example. Whether it's a collared thobe, whether it's Emirati thobe, whatever it might be, that's not really an issue. But we should try to give it significance. If we don't wear thobes, if we wear trousers, etc., try to wear nice trousers, a nice top. Try to wear a nice coat. It's also good customs. It's customary to trim your nails on Jummah, to remove any excess hair that should be removed on Jummah. Likewise, for example, you can even cut your hair on Jummah. If you are the type of person that cuts your hair every week, you could do it on Jummah and make it a part of your ibadah, and try to have the intention, I'm doing this. Why? To glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by glorifying this day. And if you go past churches on Sundays, the people standing outside the churches, they're not wearing normal clothes. They dress up. Unfortunately today, dressing up means dressing down. But they dress up. They pay attention to what they're wearing. But if you pass by masajid on Jummah, for many, it's just a ritual. Get it out of the way. Come pray and go about my day. That's wrong. It's wrong. And the glorification of the sha'air of Islam, the signposts of Islam, is from the glorification of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. And in fact, I've spoken to individuals, non-Muslims, who have had their heads turned towards Islam by Jummah, by seeing the Muslims outside of the masjid on Jummah, hugging, speaking to each other, talking, smiling, seeing the love and the community makes a difference. And so we should try our best to make Jummah a significant day. If you're at home with the children, for example, take the children to Jummah. If for sisters, if you are not working, if you're not busy with children or family commitments, try to attend Jummah. Why? Because it's a signification of the day, the significance of the day. So he says, وقال عليه الصلاة والسلام من ترك الجمعة ثلاثا من غير عذر طبع الله على قلبه. And so this shows you the importance. Again, the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام, he said, whoever leaves off 3 Jum'ahs, of course with intention, without due or shar'i reason to leave off the Jum'ah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seals his heart. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will seal his heart. And that's a sign that a problem is in a person is in a problematic space in his life, in the red zone. When a brother is not praying Jum'ah, that's a big red flag. When they're not praying Salah, but they're praying Jum'ah, you can see Islam is still in the heart. But when they've left off Jum'ah completely, that's a big issue. Whether it's because they haven't been raised around Muslims, or because they're so engrossed in the haram or in the dunya that they've completely detached themselves from the deen. It's not to judge others, it's to think about ourselves. Jummah is not something that can be missed. It should not be missed. And my work should revolve around Jummah, i.e. my work should revolve around my deen generally, but Jummah specifically. I shouldn't accept that, no, you can't go and pray Jummah in my workplace. I have to tell them, look, if I can't pray Jummah, I'm going to look for another position. Because if you leave off Jummah, slowly but surely what's going to happen is your heart is going to become hardened. It's going to become hardened. Especially when you're going to the salah and the khutbah is understandable. It's in a language that you understand. It's going to remind you. And I'm sure we can all attest to that fact. You're having a bad week, a bad day. You attend the masjid and you hear the reminder at the khutbah, and it touches your heart in one way or another. Whether it reminds you to leave something off that you're doing, or it encourages you to do something that you're not doing. It touches your heart. Even seeing the brothers. There are some people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He makes them a reminder for others. Allah gives them the ability to call others to Islam without opening their mouths. Why? Because of their ikhlas and their sidq in their actions. And so just seeing them reminds you, I need to change, I need to fix up. And I'm sure we can all remember someone that we've seen like that. They're sitting reading the Quran, you see them, you say, I need to read the Quran. Why don't I read the Quran? And so when you come to Jummah, you see people that will remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if the khutbah doesn't remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, you see people that you haven't seen for a while. You see it's a time to catch up, it's a time for community. And in a time like ours where people are suffering from isolation, they're suffering with loneliness, they're suffering with anxiety, they're suffering with OCDs. Jummah has a major role to play in alleviating a person of these things. If, for example, a person is suffering with different types of anxiety, it can lead to the person not going outside. I'm not leaving the house. I'm afraid to leave the house. I've got anxiety and worries and so on and so forth. Attending Jummah reminds them that they can leave the house. Later on, when they want to get rid of their anxieties and their underlying issues, Jummah reminds them, I do have the ability to do it. And likewise, the 5 daily prayers. But today we're speaking about Jummah, or this evening. So then he says, وَفِي الْخَبْرِ إِنَّ أَهْلَ الْكِتَابَيْنِ أُعْطُوا يَوْمَ الْجُمْعَةِ فَاخْتَلَفُوا فِيهِ فَصَرَفُوا عَنْهُ وَهَدَانَ الله تعالى له وأخره لهذه الأمة وجعله عيدا لهم فهم أول الناس به سبقا وأهل الكتابين لهم تبعا. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said that أهل الكتابين, i.e. the Jews and the Christians, they were given Yawm al-Jum'ah before us. They were informed Yawm al-Jum'ah is a day to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically. But then فَاخْتَلَفُوا فِيهِ, they differed about it. They began to argue with each other and so on and so forth. فَصَرَفُوا عَنْهُ, and so they turned away from it. And the Jews ended up worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Saturday, as Sabt, and the Christians on Sunday. The Jews, they say, why? Because a Sabt is a day where there's no business taking place, so that must be the day that we glorify. That must be the day. And they began to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala specifically on Saturday, as Sabt, or the Sabbath. And the Christians, Sunday. Why? Because they say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala began creation on a Sunday, therefore Sunday must be the greatest of days, and therefore we should specify Sunday as a day for particular worship. Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, وَهَدَانَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى لَهُ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided us towards al-Jum'ah, وَأَخَّرَهُ لِهَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ, and granted it to this ummah after those who came before us differed. وَجَعَلَهُ عِيدًا لَهُمْ, and made it a day of Eid, a day of celebration. Although Eid comes from عَادَ يَعُودُ, something which repeats. So the Jum'ah is like Eid al-Fitr, it's like Eid al-Adha in the sense that it's a minor celebration. A day, and celebrations for us in Islam, they are days of glorification. They are days of glorification. And one of the best of examples of this, al-Ashura. Why do the Muslims celebrate Ashura? What's the significance of Ashura? Anyone know? Because Musa alayhi salam was granted victory over who? Fir'aun. And how do the Muslims celebrate Ashura? By fasting. They worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to celebrate the victory of Musa alayhi salam over Fir'aun. So our method of celebrating is what? Worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Likewise, Ramadan, we're celebrating. What are we celebrating? For some people, they're celebrating the fact they can eat. But it should be, we're celebrating the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the ability to fast the entire month, to pray the entire month, and to rid ourselves of sins, and to gain closeness to Him, amongst other things. How do we celebrate? Eid Salah, visiting family, Silatul Raham, and so on and so forth. So likewise, Eid al-Adha, it's a celebration of what? That which took place in the life of Ibrahim alayhi salam, of various issues, in particular the lamb that he was given, or the goat, the ram that was given to him to slaughter instead of his son, etc. How do we celebrate? For those in Hajj, worship. For us, Eid al-Adha, we pray. And so our form of celebrating is by praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's very important to remember, especially today. Why? Because slowly but surely what's happening, our celebrations are being consumerized. Our days of significance are being capitalized. And so you go to a supermarket during Ramadan and you have an aisle now for Ramadan shopping. When really you're not supposed to eat that much in Ramadan, but instead now you're eating more or you're purchasing more. Eid now has become about buying gifts. It's good to buy gifts for children. Why? Because especially when you're living in a community where there are other celebrations, etc., and presents and gifts are bought for those celebrations, identity, etc. Yes, that's a positive. But who's going to capitalize on that? The big corporations and the product, the consumerist product, the companies, etc. So are we going to fall for that trap? If I'm spending 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 pounds on presents on Eid, it would be better for me to give that money in charity and buy smaller gifts, less significant in price. Focus on the children. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, yeah, gifting leads to love between others, etc. But we don't want to fall into the trap of consumerism, of capitalism. So our form of celebrating is worshipping. And we should remind ourselves of this by glorifying Jummah. Likewise, reading Surah Al-Kahf, the ritual aspects of it, etc., the ghusl. And then he said, alayhi salatu فَهُمْ أَوَّلُ النَّاسِ بِهِ سَبْقًا وَأَهْلُ الْكِتَابَيْنِ لَهُمْ تَبَعٌ. So they are the first to glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the week, and the people of the book are those who follow. And some of the ulama, they comment, they are the first to glorify Allah in the week in the dunya, and they will be the first to receive their reward to enter paradise in the akhirah. And then the Prophet ﷺ, he said, i.e. Imam al-Ghazali mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, he said, وَقَالَ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ خَيْرُ يَوْمٍ طَلَعَتْ عَلَيْهِ الشَّمْسِ يَوْمُ الْجُمْعَةِ. The best of days that the sun has shone upon is the day of Jummah. So it's a significant day, and we should hold the significance in our hearts. Then al-Ghazali rahimahullah, he goes on to shurutul Jum'ah. He speaks about the conditions for Jum'ah. He says, اعلم أنها تشارك جميع الصلوات في الشروط وتتميز عنها بستة شروط. That it shares conditions with all of the other salawat, i.e. facing the qibla, the tahara, and so on and so forth. But it has conditions which are particular to it, i.e. Jum'ah, which separates, or these conditions separate it from the rest of the salawat. He says, الأول الوقت فإن وقعت تسليمة الإمام في وقت العصر فاتت الجمعة وعليه أن يتمها ظهرا أربعا. So he says the first one is the time. The Jum'ah time differs from Dhuhr. In what way? He mentions one of the ways is that if you begin Jum'ah but then Asr enters whilst you are praying Jum'ah, you have to complete the Jum'ah as Dhuhr. And there's a point that we have to remember here. Imam al-Ghazali rahimahullah ta'ala, he was from the Imams of the Shafi'i school. And so the views and the points that he is mentioning are in relation to the Shafi'i school. And so you are going to find potentially some differences amongst the other schools when it comes to the time, when it comes to what he's going to mention as well in the adad, likewise the makan, etc. You are going to find slight differences. And on that point, the fuqaha generally, they agree more than they disagree. But because of the significance of the disagreements, it may seem like they disagree on a lot more than they agree upon. But that's not the case. They agree on more things than they disagree upon. They disagree on the methodologies, i.e. the kayfiyat. How do you perform this particular part of the prayer, etc. But they agree on the prayer. How do you give the zakah? What are the conditions for the recipients? Who can receive it? when and what if it fluctuates and so on and so forth, but they agree on the zakah, likewise hajj, likewise fasting, likewise penal codes and laws, etc. There is more that we agree upon than there is that we disagree upon, and say the same for aqidah, theology, creed. We agree on more than we disagree upon, i.e. the schools of Islam. And it's important to hone in on that and to focus on that in a time where you have individuals that like to focus on the differences and make it seem like our differences are more significant than our agreements, which is not the case. So then he says, if the taslima of the Imam falls into waqtul asr, then the time of asr, then the Jummah has missed him, i.e. he has missed the time for Jummah and he has to complete the salah as dhuhr, 4 rak'at. He has to pray as dhuhr. Then he says, الثاني المكان فلا تصح في الصحاري بل لا بد من بقعة جامعة لأبنية ويجتمع فيها 40 ممن تلزمهم الجمعة. He says that the place is different to the rest of the salawat. Why? Because the 5 daily prayers, the witr, the nawafil, the rawatib, you can pray in any place. You can pray in your home, you can pray in the masjid, you can pray in the sahara, you can pray in a town, in a village, in a city. But Jum'ah, he says, has to be in a place, buq'atin jami'atin, a particular place which brings together all of the people. And this is where you have the term al-jami', al-jami'. So for example, Azhar used to be called what? Al-jami' al-Azhar. And then it was turned into Jami'ah, al-Jami'atu, the university, Jami'atu Azhar. But it used to be al-Jami' al-Azhar. And likewise, if you go to some Muslim countries today, they still refer to the masjid as al-Jami' or al-Jami', which is, that's a masjid. What's the difference between a masjid and a Jami'? A Jami' is a place where Jum'ah is prayed, i.e. it's the place where the people come together. And normally it was the main masajid where Jum'ah was held. And previously, if you go all the way back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Khulafa al-Rashidun, and then slightly after them, it was the Khalifa that would give the Jum'ah khutbah. Amir al-Mu'mineen would give the Jum'ah khutbah. And those whom he delegates in areas which wouldn't be able to join in with his. And the fuqaha discuss the permissibility of setting up a Jum'ah in a land or in an area without the permission of the Khalifa, the ruler, or the delegated ruler for that land. Is it permissible for a person or a group of Muslims to set up a Jum'ah in their area for the sake of convenience without seeking prior permission from the ruler? And there's a discussion about this. Why? What's the significance? One of the issues of significance here is at-tafarruq, dividing the ummah. Dividing the ummah. For example, if you think about al-Masjid al-Nabawi, when you go to Medina, if you go to al-Masjid al-Nabawi, in fact, from my own experience in Mecca, in the al-Haram al-Makki, I've met people in Mecca from the UK that I haven't seen in the UK for years. Whilst on Umrah, I've taken a trip performing Umrah and bumped into people from different parts of the UK that I haven't seen in the UK for years. That's the significance of a Jami'. And Mecca, of course, is Jami' al-Ummah. It's that which brings the entire Ummah together. It's like the main masjid, the central masjid. So likewise, if you imagine now, if we had a Jami' in London, a central masjid in London, where all of the Muslims travel to for Jum'ah, you're going to see relatives, distant relatives, friends, neighbors, old friends, enemies, people you owe money to, people that owe you money. And so it has social benefits. There are social benefits, societal benefits to having a Jami'ah. But if you have a masjid on every corner has its own masjid, every masjid has its own khatib, every khatib is giving his own khutbah, what does it lead to? Division. If it's not division, i.e. division which is intentional, where the imams are talking about each other, etc., which alhamdulillah doesn't really happen. It's division which is a secondary consequence. It's a secondary consequence of having multiple masajid, where the ummah is not united. Why? Because they don't see each other often. Imagine, for example, in Southeast London, there's only one big masjid, and everyone from Southeast London has to go to that masjid. What's going to happen? The Muslims in Southeast London are going to be united. Financially, very powerful. Politically, very powerful. Societally, very powerful. And so having a jami' and Jummah it's a very significant thing. And it's fard upon every, he mentions here, وَيَجْتَمِعُ فِيهَا أَرْبَعُونَ مِمَّنْ تَلْزَمُهُمُ الْجُمْعَةِ. So when is it, if you have a town, a village, how many men have to be present in that village in order for Jum'ah to be fard upon them? He mentions 40, but there is a difference of opinion. For example, amongst the Ahnaf, amongst the Hanabila, etc., which we're not going to go into right now. But they have to be men, male, pubescent, sane, and living like dwellers in the city or the town, etc. If they're travelers, if they're sick, if they're women, if they're children, it's not fard upon them, but it's fard upon the men. Meaning every single man in London would have to pray in the jami' if there was only one jami'. And in order to cater to every single male Muslim man in London that was able to pray Jum'ah, how big would the masjid have to be? Give me a rough estimate. How many thousands or millions would it have to cater to, this jami'? 500,000. I would say maybe even more. Maybe even more. Why? If you take into consideration those that work in London, but they live outside of London. Why? Because from the blessing of Iman is when Iman enters the heart, people don't want to not perform worship. Even if it's not obligatory upon them, they say, no, I want to perform it, I want to go. So imagine, would that not have an impact on the UK? Think if every city had a masjid like that. So am I calling for that? Not necessarily, because it's not practical. Maybe one day. And then think if that jami' had a place of education, where that was the center of Islamic education for the Muslims in that particular region, which is what Azhar was, where the ulama, they come and they teach. Any person who wants to learn, they know that if they go to the jami', they're going to learn. They can find what they need. It becomes a center. And what's going to happen, if you want to open a business, you're going to say to yourself, let me open it next to the masjid. People need to eat and people need to drink, people need to buy things. Those students need pens and pieces of paper to write on, books to read, etc. So it becomes a central focal part of living society. Whereas if you have small masajid, that doesn't happen. 10 here, 15 there, 20 there, etc. Look at East London Masjid, for example. Look at Lewisham. It's a smaller example. But look at East London. It's a good example. East London Mosque. People travel to it from all over UK. And look at the amount of businesses that are there, thriving businesses. Even though some of them are selling the same thing as their neighbors. Why? Because of the amount of people that come through. And if you go to East London Mosque, it's very likely you're going to bump into someone you know. Likewise, here, for example, you see people coming from all over South London, not just South East, from Brixton, Peckham, Croydon, all parts of South East, South West, you'll find people passing through here. You have people praying here from Deptford, from Greenwich. Why? Because it's one of the big masajid, one of the main masajid, and there aren't few small masajid that are scattered all over the place. Which is it's a blessing, it's a benefit. And that's something to consider when we open masajid, etc., and Islamic centers. Then he says, الثالث العدد فلا تنعقد بأقل من 40 ذكورا مكلفين مقيمين. So the number, i.e. how many men have to pray Jum'ah together in order for the Jum'ah to be considered valid. So he mentions 40. And like I said, there's a difference of opinion here. And alhamdulillah, for us, it's not too relevant because we have a significant number of Muslims now that pray. And if you'd like to know more about it, go to the books of fiqh and study fiqh, inshallah. And then he mentions 3 other conditions, but we'll stop there, inshallah, and we'll continue next week, just because it's close to 9 o'clock. وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد.